Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and my channel is Discerning What is True. And what I'm going to be doing is reading chapter 2, which I talked to you earlier this morning. I was going to be reading chapter 2 of the book by Rene Schwaller called Sacred Science, the King of Pharaonic Theocracy. And I wanted to first, before I started, I would show this particular artwork here. Trying to show it to you here in the corner here. Then I'm going to be reading this particular chapter here. It's called the Deviation. Just bear with me just a minute here. To know the origin of matter and existence, such as has always been the essential preoccupation of thinking humanity, theologies have answered these weighty questions according to their particular mentalities. In the Old Testament, Moses said, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth," which is a conclusion rather than an affirmation of origin, a conclusion imposed by the impossibility of devising a rational solution to the problem. Through St. John, the New Testament says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This is a circular phrase, quite in the style of Euclid, Euclid, sorry, which he explains the geometric point. The point is the intersection of two lines, and the line is a point in motion. In other words, there is an irrational moment at the origins of things. The moment is logos, the word, identified with its source of emission. It is the schism of a homogeneous state of oneness. For Judaism, God is definitely acting, creating, that is. For Christianity, there is a mystery. Pharaonic theology speaks of the origins through the Heliopian mystery. There is none, N-U-N, the primordial ocean. Within none there is a fire which acts and produces tum, T-U-M, the first earth or hillock which emerges from none. The fire is none itself. Therefore it is said, Tum by union with his hand creates himself. This image is reminiscent of St. John. There is a mystery, but as we shall see further on, the mystery has a reality, in fact, which fact the sage can demonstrate even though unable to explain it. Thus, Quranic wisdom identifies theology with sacred science, the experiment that demonstrates the reality of theological affirmation. For Western history through Greece, a mentality has developed whose cause, not whose source, resides in ancient Egypt. We will see below where Pharaonic Egypt remained absolutely faithful to a mentality which inspired the orientation towards a theology-science. But because this knowledge of causes was dependent on a private and restricted teachings, you see, the Greeks searched for answers reason could accept, yet there is a mystery involved, irrationality, is a irrationality at the origins which makes rational philosophical construction impossible. Some of the first serious deviations date from there. They attribute a physical character to metaphysic principle, which analyzes the genesis born of the Heliopius mystery. When effects are visible, causes are sought. Experiment is the only demonstration of causes, and the mental transgression may be plausible and yet totally erroneous, just as it can sometimes be quite correct. The influence and radiance of Pharaonic Egypt in antiquity were much greater than was previously supposed. Since the Middle Ages, our Occident has been blinded, particularly by the celebration of the Greek Eletians, who preferred reasoning to experimentation. The beginning of this disquieting period of argues, argues, can be situated with the Hellenic school around 550 to 500 BC, a school founded at about the same time as the Pythagorean order, or mystical religious character. Those 5 centuries before the precession passage from Aries to Pisces stands in curious correspondence with our 16th century. Also, 5 centuries before the next predecessor passage from Pisces to Aquarius, towards the year 1500. With the Renaissance, ancient Greece was again raised to honor in the West. Greece in its day was using the tools of rationalization, or rationalism, in an intense search for the lost word. No sooner had a doctrine seen the light of day than a rejoinder was being born, either a contradiction or a stalling of the idea expressed. To contradict and to argue have always been part of the intelligent and subtle temperament of what we call of the Greeks. In order to understand correctly this long period of philosophical attempts in Greece, one must place oneself in the setting of that time, when religious expression was reduced to the incarnation of natural principles in human form. This simple humanitarianization of the so-called gods aroused the rebellion of Xenophanes, among others. But denying a religious expression and replacing it with nothing more than a rational doctrine invites other thinkers to discuss the foundational or fundamental value of such an affirmation, and of course to search for other solutions themselves open to discussion. There is a natural truth which makes itself felt but cannot be explained. This is why this Greek period of so-called philosophical disputes and doctrines could only lead to intelligent disorder and finally to outright negation of the divine or to its resignation. When the temple endowed with the wealth of its sacred science and its power of truth is no longer in existence and can no longer orient and order, men have no choice but to negate, or no rationalization can replace revelation. Thus it was that Xenophanes and Colophon in the 6th century BC inaugurated the phrase of religious revolt. The few authentic fragments of his teachings which have reached us represent the essential thought of this philosopher, but a great number of older thinkers have discussed, interpreted, and rectified this doctrine, giving a curiosity physical character to purely metaphysical assertions. Here are 8 of the principal points of Xenophanes' doctrine. There is one God only, supreme among gods and men, neither in form nor thought like mortals. Number 2, he sees all over, thinks all over, and hears all over. Number 3, but without toil he also sways all things by the thought of his mind. Number 4, and he abides ever in the same state, moving not at all, nor does it benefit him to move about. Number 5, mortals believe that the gods are born as they themselves are born, and have perception, voice, and form like theirs. Number 6, but if oxen or lions had hands, if they could draw and fabricate as do men, the oxen would defeat the gods like oxen, and the horses would defeat the gods like horses. They would represent them with bodies according to their own form. You see. Number 7, Homer and Hesiod had ascribed to the gods all things that are a shame and disgrace among men. Most often, they attributed them with such criminal acts as stealing, adulteries, and deception of one another. And number 8 here, there never has been, nor will there ever be, a man who has clear knowledge of the gods, nor of all the things whereof I speak. For even if he does chance to say what is right, yet he himself does not know that it is so. There is nothing but opinion everywhere. If on points 6 and 7, Xenophanes disavows the humanized myth, so it seems to reject all theology as being merely opinion, for only sacred science can prove a reality no longer dependent on opinion. The true word has been lost, according to Simplicius, Theophrasius, Tolius, and gathered together that was then known as the doctrine of Xenophanes of Colophon. The master of Parmenius taught that God is one, not engendered, neither infinite nor finite, neither in motion nor at rest, for the infinite and the immobile are non-being, whereas movement pertains to the plurality of objects limiting each other. Xenophanes here speaks essentially of the notion of divinity as reduced to oneness, excluding the multiplicity of the gods. His successors will discuss the possibility of multiplicity in a general sense. Xenophanes, on the contrary, admits the plurality of objects or things which limit each other reciprocally and have movement. On the basis of this doctrine of oneness, Parmenius takes a position tending somewhat more towards the physical. He again affirms the unity of being, uncreated, universe, one and only, immovable, and without end. But he adds, in name is all, that is it. Wherefore all these things are but names which mortals have given, believing them to be true, coming into being and passing away, being not being, change of places and alterations of color. But since it is perfect within a stream limit, it resembles the mass of a well-rounded sphere, equally distant from its center in all directions. Furthermore, declares Parmenius in an offhand manner, quote, there is being and there is no non-being. Behold what I bid thee to problem. This affirmation of oneness as being, excluding non-being, and its identification with the whole, led to the conclusion of a world entire and complete, full, and hence without movement. How not to react to such a concept which excludes what our senses confirm, namely variety and movement? We will return to this problem when considering Zeno's doctrine. It remained for Lysibius and Democritus to elaborate an image of the world conforming more precisely to sense supporting reason. We must remember that Xenophanes and Parmenius were antagonists to the teachings of Pythagoras, instructed in Egypt. Pythagoras speaks of complementaries, which his enemies turn into contrarieties, you see. Later, when discussing man, I will assert once again that the entire thought process of Homo sapiens is based on the faculty of negation. Affirmation can come only from consciousness of negation and the reasoning of Xenophanes and of Parmenius. Therefore, there is fundamentally error because reason, whether excluding the evidence of the sense of affirming it, like Leucippus, defines requires computation. In the negation of non-being, which affirms being, there is the action of negating, which is in fact hence a being. As to Pythagoras and Eubucer are the authors of antiquity who fought or excessively praised the master and his skill, which is why contemporary criticism rejects as fable most of ancient testimony. From Pythagoras' own hand, no writing exists, it must be remembered. Moreover, that from all these philosophers, Pythagoras, Deviation, and other Greeks yet to be cited, almost no original writings exist. See, and that many of the analysis of these philosophers' ideas were made from a hearsay, more or less mingled with opinion and interpretations. Although certain modern critics have gone so far as to express doubt concerning the existence of Pythagoras, the arguments for his existence and for the value of his teachings are many. For example, when Xenophanes and the fragments that survived him derived the theory of metapsychosis. He is clearly aiming at Pythagoras. who, according to tradition, was his contemporary. The declarations first of Xenophanes and then of Parmenides concerning the unity of being with the total exclusion of non-being, later demonstrated by the species argument of Zeno of Elea, E-L-E-A, pose a antithesis to the Pythagorean teaching according to which all is number. Aristotle also devotes numerous commentaries to these authors. The first texts concerning the Pythagorean teachings are due to Philolatus, who affirms the existence of one God, eternal, immutable, unmoving, itself like to itself, different from other things. Philolatus defines the world as a harmonious composite of finite and infinite elements, and he says that all things can be thought or known only through number. The following words are also attributed to him. Quote, "This is how it is with nature and harmony. The essence of things is an eternal essence. It is a unique and divine nature, knowledge of which does not belong to man. But as the world is formed," that's the end of this quote, sorry. "But as the world is formed of principles which are neither similar nor of similar nature, it would be impossible for the impossible for the order of the world to form without the intervention of harmony. Thus, number, as the Pythagoreans understood it, is the condition under which everything is determined and known, and harmony to the link between complementary elements whose natures differs. Harmony is here understood in its broadest possible acceptance. This musical octave is given as model and harmonica progression as illustrated. The Pythagoreans thought of unity as the beginning of all things. From unity stemmed the determining duality, which was in the same relationship to it as matter to the first cause. From these two elements, numbers result. Aristotle attributed to the Pythagoreans as saying the 10 principles, which they order into two parallel series, limited and unlimited, odd and even, one and plurality, right and left, male and female, resting and moving, straight and curved, the light and darkness. Male and female, resting and moving, straight and curved, light and darkness, good and bad, square and oblong. These fundamental principles, taken up later with fervor by the non-Pythagoreans, were violently attacked by the Eleatians. most, most counts Most accounts of Pythagoras' life agreed on the many voyages he made to the Orient, during which travels he acquired the basis of his philosophy and science. It is uncontestable that the journey to Egypt, as all authors concur on this point. Ammius specifies that Pythagoras remained for 22 years in Memphis and in Thebes, where the priests are said to have taught him mathematics and astronomy. It is important to note that of the entire doctrine invented by the Eleatians, nothing remains, nothing, whereas every positive and fundamental teaching is only attributed to Pythagorean and his school in Greece. These Greek writers themselves affirm the Oriental, meaning Egyptian. So, in other words, the word Oriental means is from Egypt. Origin of these teachings in opposition to the traditional teachings transmitted by Pythagoras. We find a grave deviation towards learned and academic thinking, which will lead directly to total negation. So what he's saying here is that basically their premise is coming in here with a certain way of doing things, and they're already beginning to stumble, and they're going to completely miss the whole point. As to the fundamental and positive knowledge generally considered to be a Pythagorean origin, Paul Tannery, Tannery, conclusions seem to be the most accurate. A severe critic, he can in no way be said to be prejudiced. According to him, the following geometric elements, Pythagorean in origin, were classified and gathered together in isouceous elements, that is, the geometry of plane figures, theories of proportions applied to plane geometry, geometry of planes and solids, constructions of the 5 regular polyhedrons, for astronomy, which Pythagoreans call spirals. The following information is also affirmed to be of Pythagorean origins, that is, the spherical of the Earth, which was at that time disavowed by the last Ionians and later yet by the atomists. Epicurus included the inclination of the terrestrial axis upon which their explanation of the seasons was based. The rotation of the Earth on itself, producing day and night, and the movement of translation of the Earth around the center of fire, which was sometimes likened to the sun. Thus it seems that in the 5th century BC, Palladius, to whom we owe the disclosure of this data, was already teaching a cosmological system, which certain modern scholars compare to that of Copernicus. Since it is known that the Pythagoreans affirmed the spherical of the Earth, its movement of rotation upon its own axis, and its movements of translation around a center fire, it is possible to conclude that the heliocentric system of Copernicus has a very distinct, what we call a distant origin. This interpretation, however, has been vigorously refuted by Jules, Jules, Segret, for the following reasons. The cosmology of Palladius was and still is considered to be the heliocentric system itself and has been attributed to Pythagoreans. This is a legend whose formula postdates Copernicus. It is important to show its lack of foundation for if the knowledge of the heliocentric movement goes back to Pythagoras, one would have to assume a very long scientific development preceding him. The history of the evolution of the human spirit would take on quite a different aspect from what has been hitherto presumed. Sacred, who would like to situate the beginning of the scientific world in Greece, is reluctant to admit to a very ancient science, but this is precisely the case with what we know today of pharaonic Egypt. Before the Greek miracle, there is indeed a very long period with a civilization possessing an elevated science on which the entire Mediterranean region had drawn. It existed side by side, furthermore, with the great Near Eastern civilization around Euphrates, though the latter lacked the theological purity that could be found in Egypt. To this we may add this very ancient and learned Brahmin and Chinese civilization. The limited medieval vision of humanity's history is no longer acceptable today. It is not the world in general that began 6,000 years ago, as been wrongly deduced from certain sacred texts, but the historical epoch of pharaonic Egypt is which begins towards the year 4240 BC, the date at which the establishment of a calendar and system of solar cycles can be placed, a fact of the greatest importance. So what they're trying to point out simply is that the system of the cycles, that is this, of what takes place, would be what Egypt was pretty much established 4,240 years ago before AD. So that's over 4 centuries. Professor Edwin Zeller, Zeller, eminent defender of the Greek miracle, denies that Copernicus was inspired by Pythagorean doctrine when Copernicus himself affirms it. Quote, it is now universally recognized that Copernicus wrongly attributed to the Pythagoreans the doctrine of the rotation of the Earth on its axis and the movement of the Earth around the sun. Copernicus indeed cites ancient writers who inspired his discovery. Should he be forced to disavow them? There is one point, however, that could particularly influence Zeller's judgment. The Pythagorean system, inspired by the pharaonic temple, goes far beyond the simple solar system of Copernicus, as it is shown by certain allusions to the central fire which emanates our own sun. In order to judge this important question correctly, it would be essential to have access to the original works. Unfortunately, the earliest reference concerning the cosmology system of Philodotius are encountered only in Aristotle. In other words, what we have is what he quoted, which is an introduction to his own doctrines, briefly mentions the opinions held before his own time. It must be kept in mind that Aristotle rejected the whole of Pythagorean theories, particularly the rotation of the earth, its movement of translation, and the natural analogy between the earth and the heavenly bodies which move around a central fire. Seeing that Aristotle intends to show the absurdity of such hypotheses, which are clearly in contradiction with his own system, which the earth is immutable in the center of the world. There is all reason to believe that he did not take great pains to present the doctrines of Philodotius in coherent form. It is indeed true that Pythagorean system upsets the Greek conception of the world. So you already got to act. You got to already have an axe to grind here, so to speak. For reasons analogs and analogous and of religious nature, the system of Copernicus in his day upset our own astronomy. It remains to speak of the earth to tell where it is situated, if it belongs to the class of things at rest or of the things in motion, and of its shape. As to its position, there is some difference of opinion. Most philosophers, all in fact, would consider the heavens as finite, say it lies at the center of the world, but the Italian school of philosophers known as Pythagoreans take the contrary view. For them, it is fire which occupies the center. The earth is only one of the stars, creating night and day by a circular motion around the center. They further construct another earth in opposition to ours, to which they give the name counter-earth. All who deny that the earth occupies the central position believe that it revolves around the center, and not only the earth, but as we have said before, the counter-earth as well. There are similar disputes concerning the shape of the earth. Some think it is spherical. Others think it's flat and tambourine-type shape. The assertion expressly states that Earth is not in the center, but that it revolves around a center fire in the circular motion. Such a theory stands opposed to the geocentric system then unanimously accepted at that time. Then unanimously accepted. Other fragments of Philodotius directly concerning this subject were transmitted by very late authors by Diogenes Laertius, mid-3rd century. So this is 3 centuries AD, where sources themselves lie in Theophrodius or Stobaios, that's Stobaios, the 5th century AD anthropologist by Athenians, a meteor percepted who might have been but a copyist himself, to whom the Plotinus are attributed to, or else by Ambilius, a Greek Neoplatonicus who lived in the 3rd century of our era. Philodotius was first declared that the earth moves in a circle. Philodotius places fire at the center and calls it the Hestis of all, the house of Jupiter and mother of the gods, altar, bond, and measure of nature. Further, he poses a second fire completely above, immolating the world. He says that the center is by nature's primary, and around the center 10 diverse bodies perform their dancing chorus, that is. These are the sky, the planets, lower down, the sun, then the moon below, beneath that the earth, and below the earth the counter-earth, and finally under all these bodies the fire of Helios at the center, which is maintained order. There's every reason to believe that in these quotations, Aristotle had at his disposal only oral transcriptions of the theory he is attacking. Later anthropologists tend to muddle everything up. and probably concerns a double system, poorly understood, to wit. The heliocentral system, which results from the affirmation that the Earth is not in the center but turns in circles. The world system, which poses Hestia, Hestia, the fire in the center. Today, we know that the Greeks seem to have ignored the fact is that ancient Egypt possessed a very complete solar, lunar, and zodiac calendar. So they had 3 different calendars. The zodiac cycle is established on the coincidence every 1,460 years of the vague year of 365 days with the solar, SOTHIC, or Syrian, SIRIAN, year of 365 and 1/4 days. All silver acts were dated according to the vague year, composed of exactly 360 days, plus the 5 Epagamental days, consecrated to the Natures, that is Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, and Horus. The Syrian or fixed year was established according to the heliacal rising of Sirius, yet the interval between 2 heliacal risings of Sirius correspond neither to the tropical year, which is shorter, nor to the sidereal year, which is longer. For it is remarkable that, owing to the precession of the equinox, on the one hand, and the movement of Sirius on the other, the position of the sun with respect to Sirius is displaced in the same direction, almost exactly to the same extent. Calculations established by astronomers have demonstrated that between 1231 and 42. It started over. Calculations established by astronomers have demonstrated that between 4231 and 2231, the approximate duration of the region of the bull, the hat, HAP, the Syrian year, was almost identical to our Julian year of 365 and 1/4 days. This period would cover the entire ancient empire, and we cannot but admire the greatness of a science capable of discovering such a coincidence, because Sirius is the only star among the fixed stars which allows the cycle. It can therefore be supposed that Sirius plays the role of a center for the circuit of our entire solar system. Quote. Thus, the double star of Sirius was chosen for these considerations, because it is the only star that moves the needed distance and in the right direction against the background of the other stars. This fact, known 4,000 years before our time, forgotten until our day, obviously demands an extraordinary and prolonged observation of the skies. But there is yet another evidence. Sirius, the Solstice, is the ancient which was called the great provider. It is constantly evoked in the pyramid texts. For example, Isis comes to thee, Osiris, joyous in thy love. Your seed rises in her, that is, she penetrating like Cyrus. The penetrating Horus comes forth from there, in his name of Horus, who is in Cyrus. In the spirit of the temple, Cyrus plays the role of the great central fire for our sun, which is the eye of Ra, and not Ra himself. It took our own discoveries in atomism and astronomy to suggest yet another characteristic of Sirius which coincides with what we are beginning to know about the atomic nucleus, made up of made up of a positron, a giant star of very weak density, accompanying a neutron whose volume is exceedingly small in relation to the atom, but where all its weight is concentrated. In brackets, it says a dwarf star of incredible density. In 1934, calculations still accorded the heavy companion of Sirius a specific gravity of 50,000, whereas gold, for example, has a specific gravity of 19.3. This is absolutely exceptional case with respect to other double stars and to our sun, which is generally according to specific gravity of 1.4 relative to water. But in 1951, according to a new observation, it was possible to ascribe a density of 53,000 to this strange Sirian neutron, which has not ceased to astound us. The companion of Sirius constitutes a remarkable exception. Its mass is indeed far superior to what is absolute magnitude when assigned it, and its density seems to be the order of 53,000 times the density of water. A fact since confirmed by other researchers based on the theory of relativity. The double star of Sirius, which for Pharaonian Egypt played the role of a central sun to our entire solar system, today suggests the existence of a cosmic system of atomic structure whose nucleus is this great provider. The Sothis, that is the Sothis, of the ancients. There might well be a need to revise our cosmology in the non-so-distant future. But how were these things known to the pharaonic sages? It seems undeniable that such a science filtered down through Pythagoras and his school, but remained occulted. This secretly should not surprise us. We are familiar with the reaction of our Western world and that of the Roman Catholic Church in particular when Galileo and then Copernicus attempted to introduce the notion of a heliocentric system. Religion, be it Greek, Roman, or Christian, is conferred upon this Earth's humanity. A heliocentric system entirely of mechanicalism character represents a deviation from healthy mentality, which for moral reasons demands a world in which the Earth is central, yes. The sky's appearance, moreover, pleads in favor of a geocentric system, perfectly sufficient for astronomical observations. Elsewhere, I have defended the religious point of view in opposition to Galileo. There is the reason to entertain the mass of humanity with a fact that serves them in no way save to rob them of their confidence in life and create in them nothing but confusion. In a heliocentric system, man on Earth is no more than a speck of dust in the universe, whereas in a geocentric system, he is the center of the world. The pharaonic temple did not proclaim the heliocentric system either, but its entire calendar system proves that the ancient Egyptians were well acquainted with it. Moreover, they had evidence stemming from what I refer to as a sacred science, which made them understand the true system even better, far from being simple mechanism. It is actually bound to the principle of Genesis, the law that presides over all becoming. Despite the small success it found with Aristotle, the heterocentral hypothesis was taken up again by Aristoteles of Samos in the 3rd century BC. This doctrine, if we are to believe Plutarch, almost became his undoing, but the Stoic Cunius attempted to have him accused of impiety for daring to disturb Hesiod's repose. Yet another text, one by Alexander of Aphrodisias, who lived in Alexandria during the 3rd century BC, adds several curious details on the system of Philetus, so vaguely described by the most recent compilers, meaning simply the Pythagoreans said that the bodies which revolved around the center have their distance in proportion, and some revolve more quickly, others more slowly, the sound which they made during this motion being deep in the case of the slower and high in the case of the quicker. These sounds then, depending on the ratio of the distance, are such that their combined efforts is harmonious. What is said here concerning a music of spheres has its origin in Pythagorean teachings on harmony. Pythagoras is cited by Kepler as being the source of his inscription and having led him to the magnificent and fundamental discovery of the laws that are the basis of astronomy. In his strange and honest work, Mystium Cosmographicum, Johann Kepler, 1571 to 1630, explains his thought process as inspired by the ancients. He defends Copernicus and apologizes to the guardians of the faith for daring to defend a heliocentric system. He judged that if the ancients proclaimed it, there was no reason not to speak of it in our time. A special argument from a man carried away by enthusiasm. His discovery, based on the 5 regular solids taught by Pythagoras, led him to formulate his 3 laws. Planetary orbits are ellipses with the sun at one focus. Number 2, each planet moves in its orbit in such a way that the time of describing a arc, ARC, of the orbit is proportionate to the area of the sector swept over by the radius vector. 3, the squares of the times of revolution of any 2 planets are proportionate to the cubes of their mean distance from the sun. This period, which marked the beginning of our history of modern science and of the philosophy of the Renaissance, is certainly a curious time. It appears as a kind of reflection, almost a reincarnation of an analogous period from 600 to 300 BC, rich as it is in men who left their names to history in all domains of thought. These were Nicholas of Cusa, Marsilius, Ficino, Pico della Mirandolo, who revived Platonism and Pythagoreanism in Europe. Luther and Calvin produced the free-thinking Paracelsus, Jacob Boehme, Boehme, the skeptical Machiavellian, Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, etc. The spirit of Pythagoras reappears, as does the revolt against religious ostracism and the deviation from the pure non-reasoning path towards the path of the celebrating mind. The history of the world is strangely cyclical. But let us return to the Greek text as we pursue the progress of what I consider to be the heir of a purely rational mode of thinking. In the wake of Parmenius, Zeno of Elec opened the gate which Abel Ray calls the beginning of scientific thought, by which he means purely rational thought. Later, Aristotle came to credit Zeno with the foundings, that is, the dialectics, which was to dominate the mentality of the West. Plato, for his part, disliked Zeno. In his Parmenius, there is a dialogue between Parmenius, Zeno, and Socrates, showing the errors of the arguments which, at the very least, could be called specious. Thus, Socrates to Zeno. Hence, it is impossible that unlike things be like our like things unlike. It is therefore impossible that multiplicity exists, because multiplicity, once it is put in position, cannot escape these impossibilities. Is this the purpose of your argument, to maintain against everything that is commonly accepted that multiplicity does not exist? As the dialogue proceeds, Socrates observes that Zeno defends the Parmenian thesis and remarks that while Zeno denies multiplicity, Parmenius affirms unity, so that although they speak differently, both say the same thing. In fact, no particular argument is called for in affirmation of unity. The contrary position, however, the negation of multiplicity, forces Zeno to ascertain the chain of reasoning that characterizes his mentality. In multiplying the arguments against plurality, he wants to demonstrate a rational oneness instead of a unity, conceived in an abstract sense, remaining theological as in Parmenius' presentation. Opposition to Pythagorean philosophy can be clearly felt in the Parmenian text, which upholds complementation. When Parmenius affirms the existence of being and denies non-being, in the final analysis, he is formulating the postulate being from nothing, nothing occurs. This is the negation of mystery, or what we call of the irrationality of simultaneously being and non-being. Zeno, in turn, takes a position opposing the Pythagoreans. He deduces under other arguments and uses a classical Pythagorean datum of his time, the definition of the point. We quote Paul Tannery interpretation of this definition. Quote, for the Pythagoreans, the point is a unit which has position. In other words, a unit considered in space. It immediately follows from the definition that the geometric entity is a plurality, a sum of points, just as number is a plurality, sum of units. Tannery interpretation of unit points is rather surprising. The custom attributed to the Pythagorean of noting the numbers up to 10 by points, as in Pharaonic Egypt, which numbers up to 10 are indicated by lines. It precisely aimed at defining the forms and functions of numbers, and in no way signifies a material composition. Thus, the number 2, noted as 2 dots, can only be a line, and 3 points are needed. In addition to the line, in order to form a first compounded surface of triangle shapes. And Phil Langdon shares this in his book. You have 2 points, that creates a line. When you have 3 points, it creates a triangle. Similarly, 4 points can only form a square, and so on. The form is immanent in the number, and the possibilities of grouping determine the functions of numbers, such as duality, division, sectorization for the number 2. Thus, the number 3 signifies the first triangular entry, of which 2 are needed to produce the first engenderate surface. 4. These expressions are possible only through a numerical notation by points or lines. They cannot be captured when numbers are noted by conventional signs. Was Tannery carried away by Zion's sophism, in other words, his wisdom, when he felt justified in considering these unit points as first concepts of automatism, when automatism is in fact a reaction provoked by Zeno's stand? Pythagoras never committed such an error. Yet Zeno, I believe, knew how to argue. This is the man whom rationalists of science would today still like to raise on a pedestal as the father of rational thinking. Zeno was not afraid to pose the premise of an absurd hypothesis for the purpose of reaching logical conclusions to his philosophical assertions. In fact, Zeno remains logically to himself when he undertakes to follow the rationalistic path. Once he has set foot on this path, he pursues it without noticing the byways that could lead him to reality. He proceeds like a child who is told a marvelous bedtime story and continues to ask, and then what happens next? And this next continues in his sleep in another world where the laws of physics do not play. Thus, Zeno, the rationalist, begins to divide and will continue to divide, unaware of the moment when the thing no longer stays the same if divided once more. The moment when there appears another complex which can no longer bear quantitative division, but demands a quantitative division where matter is energy. Opposed to this academic thinking, which Zeno typifies, there stands the technical thinking of the Pharaonic mentality. There exists perceptible fact which shatters the hypothetical continuity of the imagination processes of reasoning. Not to accept this fork in the road is to pursue the track of mechanism science, which can be properly called inhumane. But let us look more closely at the essence of Zeno's argument and the conclusions to be drawn from them. In his arguments against plurality, cited by Simplicius, Zeno proceeds by dichotomy and divides to infinity any element whatsoever of infinite plurality. He thus manages to demonstrate that by reason of this division to infinity, the magnitude of each element of the plurality is nil. This, however, is false reasoning. If a division to infinity is acknowledged, it means there will be no end to the dividing. And it is supposed that there will always be something to divide. Actually, Zeno here poses the principle of the mathematical point without quantity, a useful hypothesis for reasoning about hypothetic world. In fact, today's physics shows that quantitative division and anonymity is absurd, and at a certain moment, the quantitative molecule is composed of an energetic atomic complex. A development in physics was needed to demonstrate that function cannot be indefinitely applied in the material world. Sacred science starts from this mysterious but demonstrable reality, which shows an energetic, being spiritual world preceding the material and quantitative world. The fact of the energetic non-quantitative state immanent in the quantum material aspects exists for our physics as well as for sacred science, and it is impossible to sunder these two states in order to consider one without the other. In all the arguments, the deviation consists in considering only one of these states to the exclusion of the other by submitting it to function on a basis of continuity. Infinity is not part of this dualistic world, and in the Pythagorean or Pharaonic spirit, the notion of infinity can be applied only into the absolute unity, meaning God. That is, to the one whose name is unknown. Because the reason why that is simply there was no one there to give him a name. Because there was no one there. You see, that's why we call him God. He doesn't have a name. In the second argument, Zeno reaches the conclusion that if there is a plurality, things will be both great and small, so small as to have no size at all, and thus nil in quantity, and so great as to be infinite. This amounts to confusing the function with the fact. The symbol designates a function in which, as a quantitative is diminished, the divisor, n, meaning 1 over n, is proportionally argumentative. Equilibrium is maintained in the sense of the infinite small compensating the infinite great. The problem changes when we apply this function to a quantity x in order to make it a fact, as Zeno does. To the Pharaonic mentality, every value has its compensating complement. It is curious to note that this notion of equilibrium of alternations of the respiration that makes for life. It excludes in the argument of the Greek philosophers. In the third argument, Zeno finally demonstrates that if there is plurality, things must be finite in number, hence limited. But applying his diatomic method and the idea that plurality is a composite of discrete points, he concludes that things are unlimited because of the infinite of intervals between units. Thus, if there is plurality, things are at the same time limited and unlimited. Where did Zeno get these spaces between points? And what are those distances? If quantities are involved, these distances are measurable. If it is a matter of mathematical points whose magnitude is null, the argument is absurd. In his fourth argument against motion, Zeno also proceeds by dichotomy and manages to demonstrate, that is, number one, that it is impossible to occupy successively an infinite number of positions in a finite time. Number two, that the fact of occupying a given position at a given instance leads to the conclusion that an object in motion is at rest. These arguments of Zeno are not far removed from the principle of incertitude of present-day automata, which indicates the impossibility of mathematically knowing situation and time simultaneously. The most recent mathematical arguments lead into the same labyrinth with the invention, besides the two infinites of space and time, of a third kind of infinite, a limited infinite, which is the basis of the transfinite. The example of Achilles and the torsiole is universally known and is precisely this paradox which constitutes the principal argument explaining the present doctrine of the transfinite. The problem of Achilles was considered insoluble until the invention of differential calculus, which is founded on the deviation very principle. The argument and calculation is valid as far as the mathematician point is concerned, but most in its application becomes a determinative quantity. It is curious to see men such as Newton, Leibniz, and Descartes vying for the glory of having discovered a differential calculus based on the same arguments as Zeno, and so precious today for launching spy satellites and for raining deadly missiles on our neighbors. All mechanical applicants made possible only by means of such scholarly mathematicians. Obviously, the Pharaonic sages would have been quite incapable of making these calculations with their mathematics, but neither would the idea ever had occurred to them of inventing missiles in order to see what is happening in the universe. Yes, big time, yes. Very likely they had other means of general investigation without needing these dangerous mechanical toys, which are the glory of our deviant science. Zeno's argument have raised numerous polemics. Tamits calls attention to Zeno's affirmation of the existence of incomprehensible quantities, as well as to the definition of the mathematical point, which is in no way a unit but a pure zero, a nothing of quantity. This position is opposed by those who consider that in a body, a surface or a line represents a totality of just juxtaposed points. Thus, if Zeno's arguments are epitomized, it can be seen that they, in fact, amount to establishing by means of the absurd that a body is not a sum of points, that time is not a sum of instants, that motion is not a sum of simple passages from point to point. These conclusions call for a contrary reaction that considers the universe to be made of multiplicities of isolated points called atoms. Once again, this is nonsensical concept of the invisible invisible infinite. Here's the conclusion drawn by Abel Ray, the rationalist and enthusiast Hellenist, from the arguments and subtle reasoning of Zeno of Lit. Quote, "Our mastery consists in the interrogation of accomplishment by reason. This was seen by the illiterate and in his wake by Greek science, and this much we owe it down to the most empirical assertion of our science." The illiterate perceived this certain mysticism of reason. If we had to find an epitaph to characterize the system, that is the one we would choose. Parmenius, Zeno, and Miletos represent the mysticism of reason prepared by that mystic of counter mysticism, which is Xenophane philosophy. This school flourished in the face of Pythagorean mysticism, spread by the harsh and hard Doric, D-O-R-I-C, race of the Greater Greece, the race that built the temples of Paestum, P-A-E-S-T-U-M. That Elianism of architecture. What mystic breath did it take and construct this virtuous logic? What sense of mystery for the great clarity which transcends all appearances of ordinary life, path of salvation for thought which, like the other path, turns its back on any sensory and all too human path. To remain confined to human needs, as did Egyptian technique, or to remain separate from the great mystic efforts which strive to make us rejoin the depths of the real, as do Oriental techniques, this would never ended up in science, or would have been science, nor would the mere notation of a human experience, nor the efforts to in order to order them technically so as to be sparing of thought and to trace definite habits. It was necessary to arrive at the idea of system of things and science that are further along and more elevated than techniques. Science that is. And lastly, a great mystic breath was needed to carry the science out of the perceptible and beyond human measure, the mysticism of the demonstration and of reason, and as Parmenius' first verse, the mystium of truth for truth's sake. The author is correct, and he himself underlines precisely the inhuman character of this purely celibate science. Our 19th century was able to exalt in this fashion, but the latest stages of contemporary science provides food for thought. And even the non-scientific mass of humanity is beginning to tremble. Face it, it is with the effects of this glorified science. It's not clear what Abel Ray means by the word mystical when he applies it to the elitists who have come, as he himself brings out, from Xenophanes. Counter-mystic revolt against a purely humanized myth. Ray uses the term mystical in a sense all too frequently adopted in our day to denote simple a mental exaltation. There is nothing recondile about the Olympian arguments. They are within reach of everyone, whereas the term mystical, in the author's opinion, must be applied only to a experience outside of oneself in a religious sense, or what we call aesthete. As far as pharaonic technique is concerned, Ray's teaching is obviously confused, for we are dealing with a technical thinking and not with a technical outcome, as to the case with our own science. To start from positive fact in order to arrive at spirit and at God, such as the pharaonic path. To start from abstraction and from reason in order to arrive at technique and at spiritual knot, such as the path of our celibate science. The atomist theory. After Zeno's demonstrated the non-existence of multiplicity in order to proclaim a unity devoid of all abstract and theological character, there remained for Lubicz but to prove logically that the whole is composed of an infinite of particles. It is impossible to separate Lubicz from Demos Critias. The latter is traditionally acknowledged as the father of automatism. None of these writings have started. None of these writings have survived, and we must turn to Aristotle in that particular perspective. Where are we at? And so Aristotle, another text that comes down to us only in Latin in order to learn the principle of this first doctrine of the atom. It must be stressed that with atomic theory, we enter the domain of materialism. With Xenophanes and Parmenius fight against the humanized myth of Olympius, it is still a show of loyalty for a supernatural source which animates them. When Zeno intervenes with his sophism, he deviates toward pure rationalism and thus opens the door to the materialistic concept of the atomist, a neat trick in itself. That is, the whole is formed of a multitude of unsplittable particles and of infinite diverse forms. With this proposition, one is free to explain anything. Here's how Aristotle summarizes this particular doctrine from Livius and Demonotius. Quote, himself coming from the Eleniate school and contrary to the Eleniates who proclaim oneness, believe he has sufficient reason to establish a theory in accordance with the facts supported by sense perception, which would accord with production and destruction, motion, and the multiplicity of things. This much concealed it to phenomenon. He granted to the monist, monist, that motion is impossible without this void, and that the void is non-being, and in no way participates in being. According to him, being is the strict sense of the term, is the absolute plenum. As such, it cannot be one, but it composed of an infinite number of elements which are inevitably owing to their smallness. These elements move in the void, for the void exists. By their coming together, they cause coming into being, and by their separation, they produce corruption. They act upon each other according to their mutual contact, because the matter of this contact is not uniform. And in combining and intertwining, they generate the universe. Indeed, from genuine unity, There could never emerge a multiplicity nor unity from multiplicity properly so called. That is impossible. From this text, it is to concluded that the autonomous take into account the evidence of the senses and that they acknowledge multiplicity and motion. Motion, in turn, presupposes the existence of a void. This theory recognizes the unity of being and the multiplicity of things. Nothing can be created out of nothing, nor can it destroy and return to nothing. All change is but the aggregation or the desegregation of parts. This is a concept of substance later to be founded with Kant. Nothing exists but atoms and the void. All the rest is hypothesis or theory. The atoms are infinite in number, and thus shapes are infinite variety. The differences in all things stem from differences in the number, that the size, the form, and arrangement of their atoms. Atoms have no quantitative differences. They have no internal states. They act on each other only through collisions and blows. Here are some of Democritus' own words. The sweet, the bitter, the warm, the cold, color, there exist in the mind alone. There is nothing in reality but atoms in the void. And a commentary by Philoponus, every element is a being in a literal sense. In such a being, non-being cannot penetrate, nor consequently can the void, and if the void cannot penetrate therein, since divisions cannot be brought about without the void, the elements are indivisible. According to Zeno of Elydia, the void is non-being and thus does not exist. Elegant argument that loses its value, as Lubicz and Democritus need the void in order to give the atoms room to move in. Oddly enough, it did not occur to them that there might be a mediums of varying density, and that consequently the denser might take its place in the less dense by replacing it and thus move within without there being a void. The arguments of these ancient philosophers always pose problems within absolute conditions, even while rationalizing the relative. Seen from my vantage point, it can be said that they often had astonishing intuition, foretelling what modern science would later to clarify. But isn't our science the direct protege of these premises as they were laid down to by Zeno, Lubicz, and Democritus? Identical principles have identical consequences. When the ancients said that nothing becomes and that nothing is lost because all is but a game or particles combining and breaking up, they were asserting what Livius maintained later on. The only difference is that the ancients based themselves on reasoning. Livius did it on experiment around 500 BC while admitting the necessity of supreme intelligence to bring order into all things. Anios Clazomene already gave a mechanical explanation of the world. He saw it as animated by soul as prime mover, triggering a series of mechanical effects. Quote, for all things being intermean, mind supervends and arranges them all in separating them. The material principles are infinite in number and at the same time of infinite smallness. The Greeks are wrong to recognize coming into being and perishing, for nothing comes into being or perishes, but rather mingles or separates from things that are. Thus they would be right to say composing rather than becoming, and decomposing rather than perishing. It is of little importance whether or not Anaxagoras influenced Democritus. All that matters is to emphasize that the atomist school eliminates a prime mover intelligence as a kind of useless gear. The universe mechanism alone survives by the law of necessity. Isn't that the thesis upheld by Laplace at a time when our science, thanks to once again experimentation, demonstrates the marvelous arrangement of the world systems? Does progress consist in this experimental demonstration of what reason affirms as having logical existence? Do not synchronistic logic experience share the same domain? But is it the experimental demonstration of what Syllogis's logic leaves unexplained that makes for access to the world of the true sacred science, the incorporeal becoming corporate? What can be reached through reasoning was reached by Lupicus and Democritus, a materialistic explanation of the universe phenomenon from which all mystery has been banished. Faith in a supernatural state or being is replaced by a rationalization, which a consequence influence on the mortal position. Two paths are thenceforth available: either continual dialectic dispute on the exploitation of the master's argument, or a reaction against materialistic options, a process which is indeed sketched out by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who nourished the entire Christian Middle Ages and partially influenced Western thinking until the 19th century. In this Greek period of the Lydians and the Ionians, the search for truth employs reasoning that is often specious, sometimes magnificent, seen as a whole. It is disqualifying to compare the Occidental phrase with the brilliant clarity of the Buddhist thought in India and of Chinese Taoism shortly before the 6th century BC. These philosophers, of course, are classified as Eastern thinking, and along with Pharaonic modes of thought are referred to, which is a certain disdain by the scientific 19th century. But the three masters, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, assert for faith in a divine principle, a logical absurdity, which relates them to Oriental thought. Although without reaching the conclusions that would permit them to avoid the deviation, Buddhists accept several paths, including one which is apparently atheistic, but it does not fall into the error of purely mechanical rationalism. Laus remained pure, bestows no name, and in a few words establishes the one, and the multiplicity which springs from the one, in the search for sanity or wisdom. The righteous path follows nature, as every action evokes its reaction. Whatever these criticisms raised against these Oriental doctrines, it must be admitted that they offer the solidity of a healthy moral basis. True, they never led to an era of glorious domination of the mind, an achievement that now seems to bring us back to Babel. Returning from this Easterly digression, in examination of our Western sources, we see that after the automatists, towards the end of the 5th century BC, Athens was teeming with professors of knowledge, or sophists, usually paid to instruct the city's youth in rhetoric. Brilliant eloquence became the aim of master and student alike. Plato and Aristotle, despite the sophists, accusing them of diverting dialectics from its true aim, the good and the true, of misusing it for personal ends, for power or fortune, or lying to achieve their aims. Indeed, the sophists managed to maintain that truth is relative to the argument which sustains it, and that nothing is absolutely true. The search, therefore, is for relative truth, for likelihood, or even for error, if it can be useful. Two personalities stand out in that period from the teachings of Ionic school, Proterius of Abderdia draws the consequences of placing all faith in appearance as revealed by the senses, and therefore concluding with the relativity of ideas. Gorgias of Leontinian in Sicily substitute the relative for the absolute and somewhat resembles Zeno of Elite in the form of his arguments, which invalidates the truths of reason and reduces everything to appearance. Then during this immoral and skeptical period, when belief in God, the external provider, was abolished, there came the successive arrivals of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Yet the facility of reason was soon to gain dominance over those teachings which still allow for the existence of a rational moment. Hippias takes up the idea of autonomous and formulates a law of conduct whose later application no longer conforms rigidly to the philosophical ideas. A master teaching must indeed be distinguished from the deviation of his thinking undergoes when applied by the multitude. As a rule, the latter chooses what best corresponds to his mental sloth and his appetites. Thus, the life of Epicurus has nothing in common with what Epicureanism eventually became. Epicurus, from 342 to 270, in fact, lived according to what he taught his disciples. He showed his virtue through his gratitude and piety towards his parents, his benevolence towards all his honesty and frugality. He was satisfied with some bread and water when tormented by cruel pains at the end of his life. He courageously bore his final sickness, called himself perfectly happy, and exhorted his friends to follow his precepts: frugality, peace of mind, and the refusal of all excess and agitation. For a better understanding of Epicurean morality, it must be kept in mind that Epicurus' immediately predecessor, Pyrrho, disciple of the Meligan school, taught the philosophy of universal incertitude, which envisioned everything from two contrary points of view, nothing affirmed, nothing contradicted. His wisdom consists in a suspended judgment between good and evil, justice and injustice. This results for the conduct of life in a kind of indifference or unperturbability that is dictated by the impossibilities of judging and the acceptance of whatever happens, be it good or bad. This is reminiscent of Taoism, but Epicurus does not draw the same wise conclusion as Eastern philosophy. For along with his teachings on axis, he postulates sensation in our own source of knowledge and the materialistic system of atoms at the only reality. The doctrine of Epicurus has been mainly transmitted by Lucretius from 95 to 53 BC in Latin, and most of Epicurean Greek writings were destroyed at Heraclium at the time of the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. Lucretius devotes the first two books to the atomic theory, and the third to the negation of the mortality of the soul. Moreover, nature resolves each thing into its constituent elements, but does not reduce anything to nothing. Besides, whatsoever existence object may be in itself, it will either act or its own accord or undergo the action of other things upon it. Concerning the atom, since there is a extreme point, that is a moment in the elementary body, which our senses are no longer able to perceive, that undoubtedly is without parts and reaches the smallest degree of substance. When the atoms are traveling downward by their own weight in a straight line through the void at quite indeterminate times and places, they swerve every so little from their course, just so much as it might be called the least swerve. If it were not for this swerve, they would all fall downward like raindrops throughout the abyss of the void. No collision would occur, no shock would be produced, and thus nature would never have produced anything. This invention of a swerve in the fall of particles is strange, and Epicurus replaces the affinities he confused with free will. Quote, but the void can offer no resistance to anything, anywhere at any time, but it must give way continually at its nature's demands. Therefore, all through the unresisting void, all atoms must travel at equal speed despite the inequality and their weight. Here, Epicurus anticipates Galileo, and logic anticipates experiment. Then again comes an affirmation with regard to the mass of matter. Nothing is ever added to it, nor is anything diminuted made from it. And having explained the variety of the atom shapes as hooked or smooth or round, or as fluid, liquid, or rough in nature, and their varieties of combinations which define the properties of the compositive bodies that stem from them. Lucius writes, quote, nature therefore changes all kinds of food into living bodies and produces all senses of animated creatures. So do you now understand that it is of great importance of what other the various atoms are arranged and with what others that are combined so as to impart and receive impulses? But what is it then that strikes your mind, that puts it on guard and compels it to ever express diverse opinions, preventing you from believing that the sentiment is generated by the insentient? By virtue of the arrangement of atoms, nature transformed all foods into living bodies. This kind of thinking continues to circle a problem stubbornly left unresolved because life cannot be explained mechanically. Life escapes equatorian logic through man. It can even realize means that goes against a or beyond nature. Lerius maintains that sensitivity refers to the soul, and the soul it distinguishes at death. He asserts the existence of the plurality of worlds in an indefinite universe, and again confirms that all this happens without the intervention of the gods. Bear these well-known truths in mind, and you will immediately perceive that nature is free, uncontrolled by proud masters, to accomplish everything by itself. Spontaneity without the participation of the gods. Quote. Book 3 is entirely dedicated to demonstrating that the soul is formed of extremely fine material atoms which dissolve at death. Thus, the soul immortality is denied, and legend of infernal punishment are dismissed. The device of a swerve in the fall of atoms, or the notion of a ordering faculty in the shapes of these atoms without the slightest indication whence these shapes derive. All this seems fairly ill conceived and poorly grounded. The principle of Attar acts is an expression of laziness rather than of wisdom. Down through the ages, investigations by materialistic philosophers are characterized by a constant endeavor to eradicate the irrational moment from life and from natural phenomenon. This abstract moment, incomprehensible to human intelligence, which yet imposes itself on intuition. As they always prove to be flawed, these explanations become wearying and result in a kind of resignation that becomes the stance of the Stoics. Their champion was Zeno of Citium, Citium, who lived from 362 to 260 BC, which is about 200 years before the precessional transition from the vertical point of the sign of Aries to that of Pisces. So what he's pointing out here simply is that with the astrology signs, I'm guessing here, with Aries beginning to wane, it would be soon the age of Pisces, which will have effect upon our minds. I think that information is very speaks about is trying to think of the guy's name. Can't think of it. It'll come to me. Um, I have his books here, some of them. Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner. In the Stoics' pursuit of freedom, we find a curious similarity to the idea of the revolutionaries of 1789. A revolution was also situated about 2 centuries before the new precession transition of the vertical points from the sign of Pisces to that of Aquarius. This brings to mind a similar great revolution which took place at the end of the old empire of the Pharaohs, about 2400 BC, 2 centuries before the passage of the vertical point of the sign of Taurus into that of Aries. In promulgating Stoicism, or the philosophy of the porch, Zeno of Citium lent a certain solidity to his doctrine through the austerity of his habits, which was legendary in his own day. In his own conduct, he afforded to all a pattern for imitation in perfect consistency with his teachings. Denying the abstraction of divine intelligence, such as taught by Plato or Aristotle, the only God recognized by the Stoics was reason, as immanent in phenomenon and in destiny was cosmic law. The only reality they recognized was action, the manifestation of power prevailing nature and humanity. The Stoics reproached Plato and Aristotle with limiting moral individuality. For them, it was a matter of considering man rather than the citizen, and humanity instead of the city-state. I am a citizen of the universe, said Cicero, thus proclaiming no longer a narrow national interest, but the idea of cosmopolitan common to all Stoics. By means of the will, the Stoics sought the self-control that would render them independent of exterior forces and bring true freedom. But two different cases must be distinguished: those in which human will power can intervene and direct the activity in one direction or another, either good and evil, and thus which do not depend on human will, such as destiny, life, sickness, or infirmity. In the latter cases, the ill must be considered as affecting the body, but not the will, which remains entirely free for man. If the wise man understands the necessity reason for things, he must merge his own volition with that of the whole and cease to be enslaved. Necessity understood and will is true freedom. Thinkers, thinkers have always been tempted by this doctrine of submission to natural law, which we call necessity. When Lacies calls this wisdom non-volition, it is said to mean understood, and will necessity. Yet no contradiction is involved. In order to accept this attitude, a decision must certainly be taken. But must one not be already a sage in order to follow this doctrine? Otherwise, the latter would seem to be calling for a state of indifference, which is not wisdom but laziness. This has its echo in Allah will take care, or God will provide. As far as the vast majority is concerned, to trace a purely logical or logo-philosophical path is to install a reign of egoism. They require an exemplary model, because words without images are reserved for those already conscious and capable of discernment. Marcus Aurelius said, "Everything harmonizes with me, which is harmonized to thee. O cosmos, nothing for me is too early or too late, which is in due time for thee. Everything is fruit to me, which thy seasons bring. O nature, from thee are all things, and thee are all things. To thee all things return." There is something sublime about this doctrine that preaches independence and freedom through a merging with universal necessity. Stoicism bred what we call Roman jurisprudence, which was based on the rights of liberty and fraternity, on the sense of justice and human dignity that condemns all tyrannies, all servitudes, both civil and political, and of course slavery. In 1789 in France, this was called equality, although in this case, the concept resulted from a revolt against the abuses of the aristocrats. Pushing his theories to the extreme, the Stoic considered suicide not as an act of cowardice, but as an affirmation of individual will through free choice of life or death. To sum up, in a troubled age of increasing corruption, Epicurus and Zeno each posed to themselves the great problem which comes to overshadow all other things. Where does goodness reside? And they both understood that the true good must be in deliverance, that is, in freedom. But it is always a physical or logical freedom rather than the idea of a truly moral freedom. Rome was the capital of this world in which Epicureanism and Stoicism reigned, and a world driven to resignation by the futility of all these dialectic searches for truth. This decadent world unconsciously summed up a directive responding to this call for fraternity, that is cosmopolitanism, and for the moral freedom which a humane theory of rational freedom alone could never satisfy. It was Christian soteriology that responded. A profound as well as extremely subtle reason made the Christian doctrine one of salvation. something like the Islamic image of the Bridge of Siral, Siral, can be evoked here. The soul of the deceased must cross this bridge, separating salvation from damnation, a bridge no wider than a razor's edge. All philosophical arguments have resulted in the conclusion that man can only find peace with himself and through his unwilled and conscious acceptance of the natural course of events. Thus, the irritating problem of an irrational God has been eliminated, and thus the history of God's human incarnation came to be taught. The problem of God is no longer irrational. The doctrine of anthropodiumos presents cosmic man as well as universal incarnate in man. The ancient pharaonic teachings, now presented historically, hence concretely, will respond to both the demands of reason and the moral demands of humanity. The teachings of the apostles is superhuman history, while at the same time pertaining to actual man. This is the answer to all anxieties and a good path from all points of view. The humanized myth of Olympius is eradicated and replaced by the historical fact of superhuman being. There is a single flaw characteristic of the Christian doctrine with regard to human egoism and vanity. It poses its teachings as an article of faith, but seemingly explains nothing concerning the history or evolution of the world. And from the first centuries on, controversy again arose in Byzantium regarding the uses of doctrines such as the Trinity, then in the West. From the 9th century on, there was argument concerning proofs of the existence of God. Such belief is necessary. Does God then really exist? One does not doubt. One no longer dares to doubt the divine Christus incarnation. And so, how could this prove God's existence? Obviously, a ridiculous problem. But on the other hand, one believes in atoms as well, absurd though they be, that intellectualism, the devil's laboratory, always feels obliged to imitate it only by comprehensive the phenomenon of creation. This was the ambition of the fallen archangel. How could there be good without there being evil? To suppress one of the world's apparent poles would be to suppress the world altogether. Having situated the origins of the great deviation towards materialism, this book does not aim at retracing the entire history of Western thought. Since the beginning of Christianity, Platonic and Pythagorean schools were seen as seen to flower once again, while Stoicism suffered a definite collapse. Following the schism created during the Council of Nicaea, the Christian religion based on Apostolic and Roman Catholicism established itself ever more firmly. Then came the epoch when Islam, enriched by the works of the library at Alexandria, which influenced such Persian converts as I'm going to have to pronounce these Avicenna, Musa al-Khwarizmi, and Ibn Jabir, installed itself in Spain with the last of the Umayyads and instructed many great men of the Middle Ages at the University of Cordoba, where it was the scholars of Islam who translated and commented upon the Greek writers whose doctrines were retransmitted to the Christians by Jews coming from Spain, or examples of Maimonides. It was in this way that the metaphysics, and ethics of Aristotle, for example, penetrated into the West. Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, both Dominicans, Saint Bonaventure, Roger Bacon, brutally persecuted by the church, and Ramon Lull, Lulle, among others, were the great figures of that time. It is with them and with Arnaud de Villeneuve that the Hermetic doctrines were spread in the West. Sacred science could have fought against the deviation of the human soul of spirit, were it not that its preservation is possible only through a temple organization which selects men according to their moral qualities and their spiritual gifts. The seekers instructed at Cordoba in the science of alchemy, whence alchemy derived its name, were not regarded very kindly by the church. Arnaud de Vigny recalled to Rome by the Pope in 1313, having taken a boat for this voyage from what is now known as the Riviera, preferred never to arrive. On the other hand, Master Albertus Magnus founded the first university at Paris, leaving his name to the place Marburg in the Latin Quarter. The secret science of alchemy produced quite a few adepts, masters having total knowledge of this science, but countless clandestine seekers were disillusioned. In the meantime, Thomas continued to smolder like fire under its ashes. It would serve as a lifebuoy for a disillusioned alchemist who no more understood the esotericism of Hermetic philosophy than the teachings of the gospel. In some, it was Islam, particularly Islam of Margaret, and then later some of the Crusaders who made the link between the Near East and the West with the conversion of the Persians to the Islam. Knowledge originating in India, China, and Babylon came to be joined to the science drawn from Alexandria. What the pharaonic temple had bequeathed into the world, however, was already deformed. We may question the burning of the famous library at Alexandria, but not the looting and the destruction of the library at the University of Cordoba after the Christians' conquest of Islam in Spain. Destruction and the worst collective crimes have always been committed by humanity in the name of faith. That is correct. Amen, brother. Everyone is convinced that he possesses the only truth, but the great truth is according only to a very rare men devoid of prejudice, exemplative in honesty and discretion. But truth at that level brings with it also a power not intended for everyone. We see today what evil has resulted from vulgarization of ordinary knowledge divulged under the aegis of a liberal orientation. For want of alchemy, we now have chemistry and nothing else. Practical experiments replace dialectics. Their real or symbolic meaning being inapplicable to this science in terms of the Hermetic doctrine. Having survived, are now searched for some positive significance. Returning to the old formulas of the Greek philosophers, it could be declared that nothing is created, nothing gets lost. Therein, materialism found the proof of its affirmations. And so began the scientific era of the 19th century. Supremely confident in its assertions. There also bring again the extraordinary flowering of scholars in the domain of the natural sciences as well as medicine and chemistry, following the admirable studies at Lamarck and Darwin. A theory of evolution was elaborated. Until the end of the 19th century, with atomism and mechanical spirit, science considered itself to be all-powerful and, of course, justified in its atheism. The first doubts concerning laborious assertions and therewith the first reaction against the doctrine of immutability of matter were cast by Heinrich Becquerel, discovered the first observed effect of radioactivity and Röntgen X-rays. From that moment on, a flurry of discoveries gathered momentum towards conception in energetic terms of the pre-posterior material atom of the past. The Curiets, that is C-U-R-I-E-S, isolated the radioactive body called radium from pitchable blend, what's called oxide of uranium, and observed that the energy emitted is triple in nature and produces a new body called emanation. Transmutation is thereby no longer a fantasy, but a scientific demonstrated fact. But to say that the alchemist's dream had finally been realized is mere fantasy indeed, but there is no correspondence in contemporary science with what tradition expounds. Hermetic transmutation has absolutely nothing in common with the artificial and brutal effects produced by our modern physics and chemists. Serious studies of the texts of adepts and not mere superficial readings will confirm that fact. The results of modern science are the results of mechanical technique and not of geniuses. Not of Genesis. There is no transition between false and truth, between good and evil. It is all one or all the other. I'm going to take a real quick break. Let me get some water here. I'm about the first step here. Hold on a second, please. Yeah, I can't believe it's been been an hour and 41 minutes. We'll continue on here. It might come as a surprise to the imagination of so-called occultists if I say that Albert Einstein perfectly exemplifies a master of black magic, a man of exceptional intelligence, selfless, good, human, musical system, and the first to deploy the evil that science wrought of its discovery. Yet his science served the search for a unitary formula. Attempts have been made to relate the principles of unity of Pharaonic theology with this unitary principle as well as with the point of the universe, which French scholarship has recently proclaimed. This is this is equally erroneous. Absolute unity, the neter of neters, an abstraction which can be proved but not understood, and the universal point is a definition, a complex energetic body, and as modern science, for all its brains, cannot escape from this vicious circle formulated by atomists and which has ever even tainted our biology. The great Pasteur, indeed humanity's benefactor, repudiated spontaneous generation. Certainly, there is no spontaneous generation if one wishes to consider it a chance occurrence, an unmotivated action. But if it is but if it's understood as a phenomenon resulting from its harmonic set of cosmic energetic influences, then one must accept it and search for its laws. Today, it is possible to suggest the following new orientation. Is there a way to consider matter other than through the principle of atomism? Isn't it simply a convention hypothesis? In reality, isn't it a mass that comes into play? Besides the four quantities, mass cannot be disassociated from destiny. What is the meaning of density? The quantity in given volume. If is this a quantity of atoms or a magnetic quantity? We're always dealing with two tendencies, that is, two magnetic energies, attractive and repulsive, and two electric energies, likewise attractive and repulsive. Isn't the attraction the same, namely magnetic, and isn't the repulsion always the same, namely electronic? Here, hence, two energies. The one attracts to itself, the other causes flight. The one that attracts carries weight. Are there not the same forces which in physiology made for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? We know the magnetic effect in a mechanical fashion as reaction to electrical circuit, and inversely, we know an electric reaction around a magnetic effect. But here we are always dealing with bodies carrying mechanical or chemical energy and not with the energy itself. This dual energy must exist in the universe independently of any carrier and realize bodily form through its junctions. This may be difficult to comprehend, but posed as a hypothesis. It would be much more fertile than the hypothesis of the material atom and could open the door to a science which would be vital and no longer inhumane. It is foolish to explain materialism as a solution to the essential problems which which in one guise or another is always the problem of the essence existence of God. When abstraction is involved, thesis and antithesis cannot become synthesis. The universe itself is immanent, entirely proof of God's existence, or else is composited of invariable elements. These are the only possible positions, but there are different ways of understanding the meaning of the word God. This notion is arrived at either through pure and simple affirmation by posing God as an origin, or a conclusion drawn from a complete analysis of all we know concerning matter. Through the Thomas theory has a semblance of logic, it is actually pure fiction. Nevertheless, the absurd supposition of an indivisible portion of matter held sway for many centuries because it satisfies a mechanicalism mentality. It took the discovery of radioactivity and its consequences in order to arrive at the understanding that with the end of the bodily form, there comes the beginning of a new, purely energetic state, although a compound state. This is so-called a atom for the sake of convenience. It is true that three principles dominate this primeval compound, and this first entity indeed carries two aspects of energy and action. To proceed with an investigation in the spirit of these premises would obviously lead towards the philosophical aspect of the problem, towards a metaphysical concept of origin. Rather than follow through in this direction, a warped mentality now demands a definition that will answer to the needs of the premise of physics, and thus it is the ultimate state called the universal point that seems to bring the solution. But this means an atomic concept which defines the first state of matter as a volume. This satisfies all the analysis and suppositions of a science reluctant to abandon the material foundation, but gives no real solution to the problems of knowledge concerning matter and its becoming. To think quantitatively about atoms, such as the gospel of that inhumane science beginning with Leucippus and Democritus, it is desperate solution which lacks awareness of the principle of Sadorian science. For the opposing point of view, there is spirit or energy without material support, and there is matter in effect of the simultaneity of this energy, which divides into complementaries and constitutes a proportion such as the gospel of sacred science. Thomas unavoidably leads science towards an inhumane concept of the universe with all the moral, or rather the amoral, consequences this entails. It offers a seductive richness of creative creatures' comforts. This applied science eliminates man's endeavor. Mechanicalized and industrialized society makes humanity into a conglomerate of human atoms, particles devoid of any individual value. And that's the end of chapter 2 today. Got through 2 chapters today. No, got through 1 chapter, I should say. So that's the end of that particular chapter. And rightfully so. This is why what's happened to us now, we become so mechanical. And we also, not only mechanical, we are also always materialistic because we already thrown the spirit out. This is what's happened. This is why there's so much emptiness in life. This is why there's no more lack of love for others and a feeling and sympathy for others. It's all gone because it has no basics anymore. Science has actually destroyed the miracle of man. You see what it's done? It's destroyed it by its own science, which was a presupposition. It was already presupposed long ago to do this, you see. And we've led to this whole deal of going down the road, and the road is gone to the point simply is that man has no value only for materialistic ways, or being working in a factory that creates a product the same way that before 2 weeks ago and continues on for years and years. And it actually destroys man. and his splendor of who he is. So that's the end of chapter 2 today. A particular work, again, by Mr. Rene Schwaller de Lubicz. So thank you for being here. I know it's awful long, almost 2 hours long, but I wanted to get through this chapter. I didn't realize how long it would be, but it's a lot longer than I anticipated. But anyway, I hope that you will listen to what I'm sharing here. These are very important books for mankind. So have a good day, and we'll be on the air sometime in the near future. Thank you.